Podcasters assemble.
This is Kate from the Blah Blah the Hut podcast.
Eric Slater here from Epic Fails of History.
Hey, Chris Carroll here from the Comic Zombie podcast.
Hello, I am the Arjuna Gonzales 9001.
Hi everybody, Gabe here from the Every Marvel Movie Ever podcast.
Hi, this is Arjuna Gonzales from Peace Island.
Hey, this is Beej from the Geek to Geek podcast.
This is TroytlePower from the Power Playthroughs podcast.
Hey, it's Matt and Buffalo from Upper Pylon 2, a Star Trek Deep Space Nine podcast. This time to reminisce about Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope.
Star Wars, Episode 4, A New Hope. It is a period of civil war. Rebel spaceships striking from a hidden base have won their first victory against the evil Galactic Empire. During the battle, Rebel spies managed to steal secret plans to the Empire's ultimate weapon, the Death Star, an armored space station with enough power to destroy an entire planet. Pursued by the Empire's sinister agents, Princess Leia races home aboard her starship, custodian of the stolen plans that can save her people and restore freedom to the galaxy.
I'm probably like everybody else and started with Star Wars A New Hope in 1977, except it was 1985 or something like that. I remember starting to love Star Wars, not because of A New Hope, well, kind of because of A New Hope, but because of Spaceballs. My parents had a party, and one of the things that they had done for us kids was they put us in the living room while they were off, being, adults playing cards, doing whatever they did in the 80s, and they put Spaceballs on for us. And so I didn't know it was Spaceballs at the time. I just thought that it was Star Wars. So I'm watching this, and I see Princess Leia needing a nose job, and I see all of this funny stuff doing that. And it wasn't long after that I started thinking about it, and I wanted to watch it again. So I thought it was Star Wars. I was young. Maybe I was like 3 or 4 years old here. And so I remembered this from a couple of years before. I had gotten a little older, and I decided to go through and watch all the Star Wars movies because I wanted to see the nose job scene again.
I'm a little hesitant going into this episode because I feel like there isn't too much I can say that hasn't been said before, but I'll just start with my personal experience. This is the first Star Wars I ever saw. I saw all of them the order they came out, which I think is the best way to do it. I'm not a parent, but I feel like if you're going to show your kids Star Wars, that might be the best way to go about it. My dad and I used to do a thing, and this might sound weird because I've never really said it out loud, but we would do something called Boys in the Basement. Basically, we had this huge house in New Hampshire and a half-finished basement, but in the finished side, there was a huge TV and a couch and a whole bunch of stuff. So what we would do, we would go to Video Headquarters, which was the local video store there, and we would get a movie. We would go to Five Guys and get some cheeseburgers, and then we would just go into the basement at night and watch our movie and eat our burgers. That's actually how I watched all the original trilogy, and I think that was a great way to do it. That's a really important memory I think I had. I think I played Lego Star Wars, the original trilogy, maybe, on DS at, a family member's house at some point. And I think that's probably my first introduction. I've played those Lego Star Wars games throughout my entire life. I'll still pick up that first one sometimes and kind of rip through it, because those games are so much fun. Lego games are so fun.
So the first time I saw this one was, I want to say I was like 5, maybe a little bit earlier, but it was on TV, and I remember my uncle was watching it. I was like, what's this movie? What the heck's happening? They're in some bar, this guy just lost his arm, and there's a bunch of aliens all around the place, and I had no idea what this was. I don't know how I hadn't been exposed to Star Wars yet at that point, but it just fascinated me. I remember it was I think it was on TV, because there was commercials and stuff, and I was kind of paying attention off and on, and then Vader showed up at one point, and I really got sucked in at that point. And I was just like, I need to watch this from the beginning. I remember after watching it through the first time, my uncle was like, there's more of these. And I remember I saw it, I think Empire, like maybe a week later. Like we rented it. I want to say it was from a Blockbuster, maybe Hollywood Video. Not that it matters. We'll get to that.
So I got my parents dubbed off copies of A New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi, and I started watching them religiously and trying to find that scene. And so that meant that I thought, and because Princess Leia was dressed in her, normal Leia buns and white outfit, that it was going to be in A New Hope. And I can't remember the princess's name in Spaceballs, but she was dressed like that as well. So I watched A New Hope so many times, and I paid so close attention to it that I ended up not, just learning everything about it, just starting to really, really love this movie. And over time, it kind of became my least favorite of the original trilogy, but it's still, that's like saying oxygen breathing is my least automatic function that I have to keep me alive. It's still a fantastic movie, and I just love everything about it, but it's always going to have this feeling, this nostalgia for me that has nothing to do with it, but has to do with Spaceballs. And now the older I've gotten, and I've rewatched Spaceballs a dozen times as well, I don't really like Spaceballs that much, but it was because of Spaceballs that I got into Star Wars as deeply as I have, because I ended up really loving what I saw of A New Hope over and over and over and over again, looking for the non-existent nose job scene in the real Star Wars movies. So A New Hope will always have my love for that.
Okay, my experience of first watching the film, this was my baptism into nerd culture. I don't think I was older than like 5 years old when I first saw Star Wars Episode 4. I think this is probably the second movie I'd ever seen in my life. It's the first movie that I ever recorded on VHS. And when you're that young and you get your hands on something as cool as Star Wars, I remember watching that movie over and over and over and over and over as a kid. And so there are lines of dialogue in this movie that are burned into the back of my brain, just like I know the layout of the house I grew up in, or the smell of grilling hot dogs, or how to do long division. It is that deep-seated.
So with the previous episodes, I talked about some of my experiences and some of the clear memories of watching at least two of those prequels for the first time. And I don't remember Clones, probably because it wasn't so good. It never really stuck in my mind. And here, I don't remember watching New Hope, Empire, or Return of the Jedi for the first time either. But I think that's for a totally different reason. It's like I mentioned up before. When I was growing up, I was born in the early 80s. By the first time I saw these movies, I am certain I knew all about them too. They were just ubiquitous the whole time when I was growing up. The toys were always there. So the first time I probably ever saw Luke Skywalker or Darth Vader was inheriting my older brother's Star Wars toys. So they were just there. I never knew a time when I didn't have awareness of Star Wars. I'm sure I knew them as quickly as I knew what a fire truck was, something like that. It was just kind of everywhere. So I don't have a moment where I can go back and say, oh, this is when everything started. This is when I first saw Star Wars. I have that for Star Trek. I know when I first saw that. Not for this, because it was just everywhere.
The first time I saw Episode 4 in its entirety was in a movie theater in 1997 for the special edition re-releases. This was actually how I saw all of the original Star Wars movies, as I am too young to have seen them in the theaters. So I had never seen them, at least the whole movies, even on VHS or anything like that. So I was excited to go see them in the theaters when they finally came for the re-releases.
So I guess you could say I saw the original versions on the tiniest TV ever. It wasn't great quality, but like a couple years later, the special editions came out. 97, I want to say. And I think I was at the right age for it. I know a lot of older fans were kind of miffed by some of the changes, but I'd never seen Star Wars on the big screen before, and it freaking blew me away. Now, going back, like, as I'm older, I kind of understand, like, yeah, some of those changes were a little bit much. Like, the scene with Jabba was completely unnecessary. Yeah, it was kind of cool that they were able to add that back in and use CG to cover the original actor, and that's the whole story. But if you look at it from the standpoint of storytelling, it's completely... I can see why it's a deleted scene. Like, it serves no purpose. It slows the movie down. Everything that Greedo says, all that exposition kind of, explains everything you need to know about Han Solo at that point, so.
Maclunkey. I naturally do not remember the first time that I saw Star Wars Episode 4 A New Hope, because I grew up on Star Wars Episode 4 A New Hope. I do remember one specific circumstance of seeing this movie, though, which is my family went on a road trip when I was maybe 5 or 6, I want to say. I'm not positive how old I was, but what I remember about this trip is we had this TV. I referred to it as the office TV because it was a little, maybe 13-inch CRTV TV with built-in VCR that lived in the office at our house. And we went on this road trip in my parents' Suburban. It's the only road trip my family ever did. We drove to, across the state, but this was like a multi-state road trip. What we did is in that Suburban, I believe we had my oldest sister, who's younger than me, but the oldest one was with us, and she was in the middle row of seats in a car seat. And then we put down one of the middle rows of seats flat so that the TV could sit on that flat seat. And my older brother and I sat in the back seat and watched Star Wars. And I'd seen it before already, but that's like the first vivid memory I have of watching Star Wars, was sitting in the very back seat of our Suburban, watching it on the office TV as we drove across, I don't know, South Dakota or something like that.
All right, so we're going to talk about, I guess, Star Wars, which I refuse to call A New Hope, because that's just the first of George Lucas's many revisionist history steps. It's not done ever. I honestly don't remember a time where I hadn't seen Star Wars. I was born forever ago when they were still making these movies. The trilogy hadn't been finished yet. So I know I saw Return of the Jedi in theaters, but I was too young to remember seeing it. But I had seen Star Wars, one of the first movies I ever saw, and or at least first grown-up movies I had ever seen. I grew up loving it. I was never obsessive with it the way some people are, and I don't judge for it. I totally am obsessive about other stuff, but I've always loved it, especially the original trilogy, and the major characters are all great. Luke and Han and Leia and everybody, they're all fantastic. But I also had a lot of love for the tertiary and tiny one-off characters. Your IG-88s, the werewolf guy, all those characters. I just really always appreciated the giant universe that these characters inhabited. I thought it was really cool. And the movies are, particularly the first one, good combination of joyful and hopeful, but at the same time depressing and over, oppressive. And it's just a really great combination of different cultures kind of being put together in a stew, and you get it kind of mixed through this sci-fi filter and really great editing, and it really, the end result is really special, and it's just really great.
As a kid in the 80s, I didn't know that there weren't any prequels, so seeing that over and over again, I paid very close attention to, Episode 4, A New Hope, Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back, Episode 6, The Return of the Jedi, and so I'm watching these, and I'm like, so, especially with A New Hope, if this starts at 4, that means that 1 through 3 have to be here. And as a kid, probably 7 years old, maybe 8, whenever my parents, I lived out in the country, so whenever my parents decided to let me stay at home by myself, especially during the summer when I was off from school while they were at work, I went through every single VHS tape that we had trying to find the prequels, watching every movie that we could, sometimes fast forwarding through them, trying to get through all of them, and I mean all of them, as I could, and we had tons of them. And it took me all summer long. I never found the prequels, obviously, because they didn't exist for a good another 10 years at least. And then I was, but that was the thing. It was all because of Episode 4, A New Hope, because of the naming convention that came way after the actual release of it in the theater, at least, after it had been a success. But that Episode 4 got me digging into just the VHS tapes, trying to learn as much as I could about Star Wars, and it actually had nothing to do with the movie. It was just the stuff around it. So Spaceballs got me into Star Wars in general because I was looking for a scene that didn't exist in them, and then the simple Episode 4 thing intrigued me as a kid so much that I started trying to find it, and having no other resources at hand to really understand any of it, I started digging through every VHS that I had, because if my parents had these three, they had to have had the others.
I think this is the most important movie of all time. Can you name any movie that is more culturally pervasive and influential than this movie, the first Star Wars? First, it's probably one of the most essential bits of science fiction or any genre material at all to mainstream this into the common culture.
That first Star Wars movie is so genius in marketing and world building, and it might be the most important movie ever made. Not that it, stopped a worldwide horrible event or anything. It didn't make as much of a political impact or anything, but it changed movies forever. That first Star Wars, why do you think there's a billion parodies of Star Wars? If we're talking about fan films, parodies, oh my god. Family Guy, Robot Chicken, every third skit is Star Wars. I would love to just list all the parodies, but we would be here all day, and I want to hear the other people talk, so I won't. But point is,
what nerd culture is now, what I live and breathe, and probably what most of these listeners here live and breathe, is just common pop culture. And was it before this? Not so much. Look at Logan's Run or the Westworld, Future World that came out pretty much immediately before this. Was everyone seeing it? Was everyone knowing about it? Not only that, the cultural just bringing this all to the mainstream, and this kind of goes along with it, but think of all the movies beyond just the sequels that are a direct line from this. All the movies that, of course, tried to be immediate just knockoffs of we have to come out with the Star Wars knockoff. They're everywhere. They're all jokes. I mean, you have your Turkish Star Wars, for instance, which is an internet meme, or Star Crash. But it's just endless how many science fiction adventure blockbuster movies came out of this. Hell, the concept of summer blockbuster movies in general was a direct result of this. And then just all that concept of, again, just the cultural pervasion. Look at all of the toys that came out of this movie. All those things together, and some of the things that we're going to detail coming up, led to just everybody knowing about this. I know a handful of people. My wife, for instance, when we first started dating, she had never seen Star Wars. But she knew Darth Vader, she knew Luke Skywalker, she knew their relationship, she knew half of the spaceships, she knew the basic story from never having seen it. And then you have the movies, for instance, like Godfather. She never saw that either, but she never really knew any of the story of that. Somehow, having never watched the movie, she still knew all about Star Wars because it's just out there. It's everywhere. It's so damn important.
Music cues. This is something that every Star Wars movie, well, except for the spin-off movies, every time you see this, you just get so pumped. And I'm saying it now because this is the first Star Wars movie that was ever made. Those opening credits, the title crawl, when that music just kicks in, Every time I'm in a theater, the first time, since I am probably younger than everybody else who submits to this podcast, the first Star Wars movie I ever saw in the theater was The Force Awakens, and when that happened, I was just I think I was, like, crying. Like, it was just such an intense emotional experience to see that on the big screen, but it just comes up and then, and it's like, wow, what the
Maclunkey.
Like, I am in for a ride, and I love that. I love that feeling.
Can you name a movie that has more influential, iconic, evocative, instantaneously recognizable music than this? There's not going to be a whole heck of a lot. Think about it. From this movie alone, you have the opening fanfare. Star Wars flashes up on the screen. Who among us in this listening audience doesn't get chills when they see that, when they go to see one of these new Star Wars movies? You do absolutely get chills.
Right away when the movie opens up, you get one of the most iconic shots in filmmaking with the Star Destroyer passing overhead as Darth Vader is in pursuit of Princess Leia Organa. And this is great. We all know this is great, right? But it's only made greater by having now seen Rogue One. I actually watched Rogue One right before going into watching this one. And yeah, just seeing Leia get the stolen Death Star plans and then taken off with Darth Vader in pursuit after he just slaughtered a bunch of the rebel troops just makes this so much more intense.
And, okay, how about all that? Is that enough for you? I don't even want to get into the concept of droids. Come on. No need to talk about that. Iconic.
When you were a kid, was there anything better than C-3PO and R2-D2? Their entrance into the franchise is fraught with danger as they run across the hall from some stormtroopers. All the while, C-3PO is just making goofs, R2-D2's squeaking and beeping and being all cool. They are absolutely the best. I two of the greatest characters in fiction, and I say that kind of facetiously, but mostly not. I love C-3PO and R2-D2, and they're great right off the bat here. And of course, Princess Leia gives R2-D2 those stolen plans, so they're important to the plot, but also they're just a lot of fun. How can you not like C-3PO and R2-D2?
My favorite droid moment, there are so many to choose from, it's not like 5 or 10 minutes will go by before R2-D2 either directly saves the lives of the human protagonists, or he does something to help make sure or ensure that the Death Star plans will make it into the rebel hands or keep them out of the hands of the Empire. Like, my interpretation of this movie is that it's, skewed in a bunch of different ways to keep the focus on the humans, but the true protagonist of this movie is R2-D2. Like, why in the galaxy far, far away did they not put a medal on R2-D2 at the end? He easily did just as much as Luke and Han did.
Now, down on Tatooine, R2-D2 and C-3PO have been taken by the Jawas, which I'm always confused by because little kid Troy saw Spaceballs and then mixed up the Jawas and the creatures from Spaceballs who walk around going, date, 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 date. And I always expect the Jawas to sing that song in Star Wars. They don't. That's not in the actual movie. That's in Spaceballs. But I think it's going to be in there every time. But of course, they bring those captured droids over to the Skywalker homestead. I guess it's not the Skywalker homestead because Shmi Skywalker married Lars, who already had Owen, and then Beru is his wife. What is their last name? I don't know what Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru's last name is. In any case, the Jawas bring the droids there, and we get my favorite character in Star Wars, not because of anything he does in Star Wars, but because of some of these supplemental materials. I actually bought a comic book just because I was intrigued by this character, and that is Skippy, the Jedi droid.
I do love another, I wouldn't call it a supporting character, but I gotta say I was always intrigued by it, and even had the toy. Of course, I had all the friggin' Kenner toys. I was obsessed. But the when Luke and Owen go to buy 3PO and R2, before they buy R2, they buy the red R2 unit, and forgive me again, I know there's people out there like, it's R64. but I was always obsessed with the red R2D2. I always like those like off-brand versions of in the beginning when everyone's running to the escape pods and everything, and there's that like silver C-3PO. I was like, man, I bet he's even cooler. Like, I always liked those characters. I always wanted to see like a black furred Chewbacca. I was like, oh man, that'd be cool. They look different.
If you're uninitiated, you're sitting there going, Skippy the Jedi droid, what the heck is he talking about? If you remember, there is a red R2 unit that Uncle Owen actually picks out. He does not pick out R2-D2 from the lineup. He picks out C-3PO and then this red astromech droid. He might not be an R2 unit. He's got more of the conical head. But in any case, that R2 or that astromech droid, whose name is Skippy, starts to step out of the line over to C-3PO. And then his top part of his head just pops off and explodes. And Luke goes, Uncle Owen, this R2 unit's got a bad motivator. I guess he is an R2 unit because I'm pretty sure that's what he says. And then 3PO's like, oh, you should get that droid over there. He's great. Now, what you don't know, if you've only seen the movie, is that Skippy, that droid, was force sensitive. He was a force sensitive droid. And the reason that his head blew up, there was nothing wrong with him. He didn't have a bad motivator. What happened was that he could sense the future, and he could sense how important it was going to be for R2-D2 to join up with Luke Skywalker in order to bring the plans to Obi-Wan Kenobi, in order to get them to all go and attack the Death Star so that the Death Star would blow up, so that the Emperor would have to switch to working more aggressively on the second Death Star, so that eventually Luke Skywalker and Anakin Skywalker could end up on the second Death Star together at the same time that Emperor Palpatine was there, so that Anakin Skywalker could shift his allegiances back to the light side and help Luke Skywalker in destroying Darth Vader and ending the Empire. And in order to ensure all that happened, Skippy the Jedi droid sacrificed himself. He's the real hero.
I love droids in general, but there's something about the Gonk droid, and he's just gonk, 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 gonk. And I think he's like a battery or something like that. So that would be a useful droid to have. Like, you'd always have backup and your phone would never die. Let's hear it for Gonk droid.
My favorite music cue, it's probably that moment on Tatooine where Luke's staring at the binary suns. It's just so iconic, and it just really sets the tone for the rest of the saga, honestly.
He looks off into that binary sunset, and you can just tell that it's a changing moment in his life. And from that time forward, he's no longer Luke the farm boy. He is Luke the future Jedi. Everything about that moment is so beautiful. The sunset, the music, and you can just feel Luke's emotions, and it's wonderful.
I kind of look at the scene where Luke is sort of, walks out of the house and he's staring at the binary sunset, thinking about striking out on his own. And it feels like it's just rubbing it in the face of the audience a little too much that he wants to go out on his own. After all of that stuff in the previous scenes where he's talking about going off to the academy next season or what have you, sure, he's out there and it's like George Lucas is going, see? He wants to leave. He really wants to get out of there. Okay, George, we get it.
I mean, you can't talk about great light side moments without talking about Luke Skywalker igniting the lightsaber for the first time, right? He's a dumb farm boy who doesn't know what to do with it. But just that moment of, your father left this. He wanted me to, or he wanted you to have it when you were old enough. Like, it's so good. Just seeing as he swings it around the room. I mean, that's what we all did when we were kids, right? You had that lightsaber and you swung it around. Whether your lightsaber was an actual toy lightsaber or a stick you found in the yard, like, we've all done that.
He is quite literally a dirt farmer, and he ends up being Luke freaking Skywalker. Yeah, he's all whiny at the beginning, but he becomes so instantaneously identifiable. You just want to root for him. He's such a easy person to root for.
So my favorite light side moment is kind of tough because there's a few really good moments in this movie. I'm kind of leaning towards that scene where Obi-Wan first tells Luke about the history of the Jedi. And he talks about his father was a pupil of his until he turned evil. that whole monologue. But if you're coming to this fresh, it's really one of those moments that like really builds up this mythology in your mind. Yeah, I don't know. There's just there's a sense of like what the Jedi are supposed to be. So yeah, I love Alec Guinness in this movie. He really brings a lot of what's the word I'm looking for? Prestige, maybe? He brings a level of authenticity to this role. It comes across as totally credible when he has that conversation with Han Solo, and Han's just like, it's a bunch of shenanigans or whatever, hokey religions and ancient weapons. I don't know, but yeah, I love Obi-Wan in this movie, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Obi-Wan's speech about how, for 1,000 generations, the Jedi Knights were the guardians of peace and justice throughout the galaxy. All that, I love that. I love a long speech, and it does that amazing world building that's laced throughout this entire movie, and really every single movie in the franchise. I think that's why there's so many fan films and, like, merchandise and spin-offs for these, is because it's, from the start, was such a rich universe, and it'd be weirder if it wasn't tapped for all it's good for.
I talked about not remembering seeing this movie for the first time, but I do have another very specific kind of first-time memory about this movie, which is I remember the first time that I realized that when Luke Skywalker went back to his homestead looking for his aunt and uncle because he realized that the stormtroopers might have tracked the droids back there, and he sees the charred skeletal remains of the aunt and uncle who raised him, young Troy somehow didn't notice those charred remains, or they didn't register in my memory. And then I remember the first time that I saw them, and I say young Troy, I might have been, this might be my earliest memory, but I remember being really upset when I realized, oh my god, those are skeletons. That's his aunt and uncle. I thought that like stuff was just burned up and stuff, but then one time I watched this and I realized that's them. They're dead. They're dead and burnt so much that they're just skeletons left over. It's messed up.
Can you name a movie that has a more iconic villain in it? No, you can't. Spoiler, the most iconic movie villain of all time is Darth Vader. It's his look, it's his sound, it's his capabilities, simultaneously mixed with the mystery around him. He is instantaneously identifiable as an incredibly bad person you don't want to mess around with.
Most memorable moment, the part that really sticks out to me and that I remembered the most as a kid, is when Vader chokes out the officer in the meeting where it's kind of weird in that first movie because Vader's never really the main bad guy. He's the most memorable because he's the first one you see, and he's got that iconic look and James Earl Jones's imposing voice and everything. But it's really Tarkin is the villain in the first movie, and so when you first see Vader in that meeting, he's kind of like somebody's second, and it's not until that one dude mouths off with like, "Oh, yeah, silly, outdated religion, meh," and he almost murders the guy with his hand without ever touching him, and you're like, whoa, it really stands out, and it's a really iconic moment, not just in Star Wars but in film in general.
My favorite dark side moment is that moment on the Death Star when Admiral Mahdi is kind of making fun of the Jedi, and he says, "Don't frighten us with your sorcerer's ways, blah blah blah," and he's kind of making fun of Darth Vader and his Jedi past. And Darth Vader's having none of it, and he says, "I find your lack of faith disturbing," as he force chokes him. So that really tells you all you need to know about Darth Vader, and it's just a very good quote too. I use it a lot in my day-to-day life.
I find your lack of faith disturbing. Darth Vader choking people will never not be cool. I love that we get this moment in A New Hope where there's just like this boring conference room meeting happening between all of these like stuck up suits in the Empire talking about the Senate, and it's like it's just a little bit of that boring stuff that George Lucas thought he should make a whole trilogy out of. You get just a little bit of it here, and it's like capped off by like, this guy won't shut up about talking about like bureaucratic nonsense. And how does Darth Vader handle it? He just chokes a dude, and it's great because it's like, it's fun in the moment because again, we've all done that, right? Like pretended to use the Force to choke somebody who's annoying us. But also it's great because I just imagine Anakin Skywalker inside of that suit being like, oh my gosh, I'm so tired of dealing with bureaucrats. Ugh, just stop it. Just be quiet. And take your trade blockade and shove it. You must come with me to Alderaan, if you're to learn the ways of the Force. Luke and Obi-Wan end up going to Mos Eisley Spaceport, where they're going to find a ride off of Tatooine. I like the dirty, grungy feel of this. This is something that's really important to the feel of the original trilogy to me, is that everything's kind of worn down. Everything's it's just a little bit dangerous, you know? It's not a nice place to be, the galaxy. It's a little dangerous, a little rough and tumble. And as you enter Mos Eisley, you get, again, this movie is just full of like the most classic moments ever. One of the best moments is just Obi-Wan Kenobi. There he is, and using the Force on the weak minds of the stormtroopers. Like, these aren't the droids you're looking for. Or, these aren't the droids we're looking for. It's so good. You just, like, how many of us when we were kids didn't try to do that to our parents? Like, your mom's like, go clean your room, and you're like, I don't have to clean my room. She's like, no, you have to clean your room, and you're like, I don't have to clean my room. And she goes, what, do you think you're some kind of Jedi waving your hand around like that? That's what all of our moms sounded like, right? Like Watto.
You have Leia's theme. It's not super present in this, but that is when you hear that in one of the trailers in the new movies. It throws you back to when you were a kid watching this the first time. The triumphant throne music at the end during their celebration, it's just unbelievable. And my God, the Cantina song. All this is just this incredible orchestral music, and then you have such an iconic little ditty thing. And this movie doesn't even have that Imperial March. That only comes up in the second movie. So, this series still has plenty of tricks up its sleeve.
Enter Han Solo and Chewbacca the Wookiee hanging out in the Mos Eisley Spaceport, looking for somebody to give them just a little bit of scrap to take them on a trip. And then they find them, they're getting hired, and then like there's stormtroopers show up. I've always thought this was weird because the stormtroopers show up and the bartender points over there, and suddenly Obi-Wan Kenobi and Luke Skywalker gone. I always imagine they're hiding under the table. The table does not have a skirt on it, so it's not like it's got a tablecloth. It's like a solid block. But little Troy always assumed that Luke Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi are underneath that table hiding from him. And then you meet Greedo, and Han Solo absolutely shoots first. I don't care what you say, George Lucas. Most of the updates to Star Wars, I don't mind too much. You put in your little CGI animals, you put in your blinking banthas or whatever, I don't care. But Han Solo shot first.
My favorite minor character. So the version of A New Hope that I watched was, I think, based on the remaster they did in, 1997 or something? Where they added a whole bunch of CG scenes that George Lucas couldn't get to work in the original. Including the one where Han Solo has his whole conversation with Jabba the Hutt about how he's going to pay him back. And Jabba the Hutt, for the purposes of this episode, is a minor character, and that's an addition I like, and I do think it really does work well within the movie. Another scene involving a minor character that was changed as a result of the 97 remaster that I didn't like involves Greedo.
Maclunkey.
We had to talk about the Han shot first, Greedo shot first controversy sometime, right, editor? When I first heard about the controversy, I didn't know about it when it happened, but when I heard, there were people who actually argued on the internet about, whether it's better that Han or Greedo shot first, I just rolled my eyes and thought, this is the kind of thing that nerds with too much time on their hands argue about. That is some peak Simpsons comic book guy stuff. But having rewatched it, I kind of understand where it's all coming from. And I would honestly put myself in the Han shot first crowd as because it just sort of makes sense as far as the cinematic language of what was communicated, the constant cuts down to him grabbing his blaster. It also sort of fits his character arc more naturally, where, like, at the start of the movie, he only cares about money, and he's starting to care about things other than himself and people other than himself.
Can you name a movie character that's more iconic, who is your roguish anti-hero character? Again, spoiler, no you can't, because that is Han Solo. Can anybody tell me there's a movie character out there that is more cool or badass than him? You cannot. I love me some spaceships. And again, here I will challenge you once again, listeners. Can you think of a more iconic spaceship ever in TV or movies? Here, I'll even kind of start right off the top here. I'll give you maybe the top 3, 4. You have, hey, I'm a Star Trek guy. I keep saying Star Trek every time when I want to say Star Wars. But we probably have the Enterprise. That's up there, right? And here, we'll even go generalized. How about the generic rocket ship that you see from the 50s, that classic silhouette, or the flying saucer? But you have those, but I still think maybe trumping all that is the Millennium Falcon. It's instantly lovable because it's a piece of crap. Everybody tells you it's a piece of crap, and then it kicks so much ass. It's so identifiable, even though it has this bizarre little shape. It's, to me, this is kind of mind-blowing that people can love and identify something that is not symmetrical. That's such a weird idea that it's got this little bump off on the side. It just is weird because we're attracted to symmetrical things. Yet this thing is so loved, and rightfully, I should call out there, it is so rightfully loved.
My favorite vehicle or ship or anything in any Star Wars movie is the Millennium Falcon, so that's an easy choice.
For my favorite ship, I gotta go with the Falcon. I mean, how do you not? The Falcon is just such a cool ship. It's got everything you need. It looks like a hamburger. It can go into hyperspace, and you can smuggle yourself inside, and it just looks really cool. The Falcon has taken on a character of its own throughout the Star Wars movies, so props to the Falcon.
But going beyond that, think of the other absolutely essential spaceships from this movie. The X-Wings, TIE Fighters, and the Death Star. Each one of those is also nearly culturally ubiquitous. My wife knows what an X-Wing fighter is before she ever saw that. Again, that means nothing to you, but that's mind-blowing to me. And then why even stop there? Then those are your A-listers, A-plus listers. You have still one of my personal favorites, but I can't, in good conscience put it up there with the rest, is your Y-Wing, your blockade runner, and of course, Star Destroyers. I mean, simple triangle. If you get down to it, what's more, like, maybe the most iconic part of this whole thing is that opening of just seeing the intimidating Star Destroyer going over your head, and that's the only evil people would have that ship. Damn, all of it is just so amazing.
As always, my favorite ship's going to be the Imperial Star Destroyer. But I got to give an honorable mention to the Death Star. I mean, that counts, right? That's totally a ship. I mean, it's not quite a moon, obviously.
Ships, I can't cement one. I don't know. Star Destroyers, the Death Star, the Tantive 4, I would say, if I had to pick one, because I just always loved that design. X-Wings, Land Speeders, TIE Fighters. There's so much innovation in the sci-fi world that became instantly iconic in this movie. I can't pick just one. And the Millennium Falcon, it's probably the Falcon. I mean, that's probably the best spaceship ever.
My favorite dark side moment. There's so many good Vader moments in this movie, but honestly, I think the best moment that fits the bill here is when Grand Moff Tarkin destroys Alderaan in front of Leia, even after she supposedly reveals where the rebels are hidden. That's just cold, man. That's just pure evil. Yeah. As far as Star Wars villains, Tarkin all the way. Dude, that guy, he's not messing around.
And as far as dark side moments, it's really hard to look over the destruction of Alderaan, genocide on a planetary scale. That's more Grand Moff Tarkin than it is Darth Vader, and of course Darth Vader's entrance, that's another one that's just like, oh my god, that is filmmaking 101 right there. and it's perfect. But blowing up a planet while the princess of the planet is being held captive a million light years away, or however far it is. Yeah, I know it's not how they measure distance in Star Wars, but I'm just saying, practically, that's far away. But she's watching that blow up, and it's a peaceful planet. It's so horrible and kind of amazing.
Honorable mention to Grand Moff Tarkin for his genocide. That's so insanely cold and hardcore. It's incredible.
When Darth Vader's trying to get the location of the Rebel base out of Princess Leia, he's got that droid. Listen, your boy has a fear of needles, and I think it came from this droid. This like droid comes in making all kinds of noise with a giant hypodermic needle sticking off of its front that it's going to inject her full of truth serum with or something. That thing's messed up. That's a terrifying torture bot. Why? Don't make things like that. Like, how can you make a thing like that and think you're the good guys? I guess also, how can you make a thing called the Death Star and think you're the good guys? Does the Death Star have an official designation that's not something terrible? Huh. That just occurred to me. That was a spontaneous thought. I don't know. Maybe it does.
So, of course, the original trilogy is full of amazing quotes, but I'm going to single out Princess Leia's, "I recognized your foul stench when I was brought on board." Carrie Fisher masterfully kind of mocks Tarkin with that clipped British accent, and it just goes a long way to show how sassy Princess Leia is. And despite being tortured endlessly on the Death Star, she still has a lot of fire, and she is feisty. So that's my favorite line.
To this movie's credit, it was woke because it immediately subverted that this princess character is not necessarily a helpless person. She picks up a gun right away, given the chance, starts fighting. She's so vocal she can hang with your heroes, and also that incredibly top villain of all time that you kind of know the instant you see him that he's the most iconic villain of all time. She is in his grill at the beginning, standing up to him. So, like, one of the first things you see of her is standing up to one of the most iconic villains of all time, right from the start.
Favorite musical cue has got to be Princess Leia's theme. This song is just a masterpiece, and it's sweeping and tender and hits you right in the feels. And if you've ever heard it like live in a symphony or something like that, it could probably bring you to tears. So once again, we see the maestro, John Williams, just going to town and making a beautiful theme for a beautiful princess. And of course, you can't hear Princess Leia's theme without immediately thinking of the wonderful Carrie Fisher, who is an icon by herself. So yeah, this song definitely has great emotional meaning.
We get some maneuvering away from Star Destroyers as the Millennium Falcon takes off. The first flight of the Millennium Falcon. And of course they end up like jumping into the dead remains of Alderaan because it's been blown up by the Death Star. And then they start following this TIE fighter. They're like, that ship can't be out here all on its own. It must have gotten lost from a convoy. It's headed towards that small moon. That's no moon. It's a space station. Impossible. There's no way there's a space station that big. It is, and they get pulled in by the tractor beam. And then our intrepid heroes are trapped in the belly of the beast. At this point in the movie, we go into like heist mode because Luke and Han Solo are wearing the stormtrooper uniforms going on undercover through the Death Star, while Obi-Wan Kenobi is going and shutting down the tractor beam. They've got to go find the princess. They go down to the cell block. You get some of the best Han Solo. Listen, Han Solo is a great character, but part of what makes him so good is that he's just fumbling constantly, much like Indiana Jones. Like, Harrison Ford is just good at playing a guy who accidentally succeeds. Like, he's got low stats, but he rolls 20s all the time. That's Han Solo in a nutshell.
My favorite quote, and I'm sure there's going to be people who hear this that are correcting me and pulling their hair out because I don't remember the exact phrasing of it, but it's when Han and Luke and Chewie are in the Death Star and they've snuck on into the prison block as stormtroopers and everything, and Han shoots the guy, and the radio goes off, and the security team or whoever's checking on everything, and Han's like, no, everything's fine here. How are you? And it's that pause and the "How are you?" that I feel like it's so good. I feel like it was Harrison Ford ad-libbing, but it's perfect amount of levity at a moment, which is, I'm not going to say like stressful, but it's a little tense, and it's perfect.
It's good. It's good. It's some good Han Solo right there.
As for anything else, I will mention that the scene where Obi-Wan Kenobi is sneaking around the reactor inside of the Death Star, hiding from stormtroopers and just sort of slowly turning off the switches on it, that is a scene that has served as the inspiration for quite a few areas in Doom maps, because, you know, science fiction and computer nerds, Star Wars fans, Doom mappers, there's a lot of overlap there. And so there are plenty of, like, old Doom maps from the 90s that involve, like, an area with a catwalk leading to it and a small little ledge that you have to flip a switch on, and maybe there are monsters and nearby catwalks that can also shoot at you, not just because it's a good combat setup, but just as sort of an homage to that old Star Wars scene. Especially since the aesthetics of Doom are largely influenced by Star Wars, as the creators of that game have talked about.
You know, when you were a kid, the lightsaber battle between Darth Vader and Obi-Wan Kenobi was awesome, and it's hard for me to say a negative word about Star Wars Episode 4: A New Hope, but this lightsaber battle sucks. It's boring. They're just standing there, just going like, the sound effects are great. I'll give it that, but it's not a good fight scene. Like, I guess part of it is that, like, in the original series, the original trilogy, the idea with the lightsabers, they fought with them kind of like they were broadswords, and in the new series, they fight with them more like they're like a katana or some kind of a light, swift blade. But it's boring, man. It's not good. I still love Star Wars. I love the sound design on it. It gets me emotionally to see Obi-Wan Kenobi facing off against Anakin Skywalker again. But these two, either if you look at the movies in order, either these two forgot how to fight, or they're just really, really, really old.
I do like the lightsaber duel inside the Death Star between Darth Vader and Obi-Wan Kenobi. It's a good scene. If this movie came out in 2007 instead of 1977, I think it could have been a better scene, because it would have been able to work in more references to the fight at the end of Episode 3. So we would have more than Darth Vader just saying, "When we last met, I was the learner, now I am the master."
And then, of course, Obi-Wan Kenobi gets struck down, becoming more powerful than Darth could ever imagine. And Luke sees it and screams, "No!" But then they have to run away on the Millennium Falcon, and
Obi-Wan's sacrifice, that's a real Jedi moment, I think. Sometimes you gotta do stuff, because it is a war. You see that more in the prequels, that they're at war, but that's definitely a moment where it's like, these are important sacrifices made by important characters on both sides, and I think if he'd just been killed without giving himself up to help Luke, even though it didn't really help Luke in the end, I think that's just such an important, crucial moment to cementing what the Jedi are about.
I know a lot of people argue that that moment is completely unnecessary. Well, it's the hero's journey. My favorite supporting character would probably be the general who explains the attack run on the Death Star. Basil Exposition, I think his name is. I forgot to IMDb it. General, it starts with a D, I think. I mean, I did know at one point because I used to be way too into this stuff, but you know.
I really like this scene because I feel like this scene has been culturally relevant in a way that may not be immediately apparent. And the way in which I think it's been culturally relevant is that I think game designers who are making video games now all grew up watching this scene. Game designers who've made games basically in the modern era of video games, starting like with the original Nintendo, grew up watching Star Wars. And the breakdown of like, you'll have to hit the exhaust port, it's only 2 meters wide. Like, I feel like that's just how video games tell you what your objectives are. And I think that I think you could probably trace it back to this. So Han Solo sets off with his reward as the rebel forces scramble from their hidden base on the moon of Yavin to go and take on the Death Star. And we see the X-Wings in action for the first time, where they lock their S-foils into attack mode and their wings split open. This is such a cool little ship. X-Wing is a great ship design. Battlestar Galactica's Raptors are up there, I think, as far as like greatest spaceship designs for me, as far as, you know, the little one-man fighters, but only because they do the flips around and stuff like that. If you put some of the maneuvering thrusters from a Raptor onto an X-Wing, bam, best single-man fighter spaceship ever. That's all it needs. Just let it do flips.
As far as favorite moments, it's really difficult to choose. If I have to pick a light side moment, I mean, for this first movie, to me, I don't think there's any really debate about it. It's got to be the trench run on the Death Star, where Luke really trusts the Jedi powers for the first time, and Obi-Wan talks from beyond the grave, and Han Solo punks out Darth Vader, and it's everything you would want. I mean, even when you go back and see the other movies, when you think about, man, that was really cool. Like, Luke was basically a kid, and Han Solo came in and saved his life, and at the same time, Luke, you know, did all this crazy stuff with his brain and everything. It was just really sweet.
My favorite light side moment is during the final trench run near the end of the movie, and Luke hears the disembodied voice of Obi-Wan Kenobi saying, "Use the Force, Luke." And he switches off his targeting computer. He's going to fire the proton torpedoes just by eyeballing it. As corny as this may sound, that line has been there for me in plenty of situations throughout my life where trusting my gut or going on my intuition really was the right thing to do, and I had to shove aside a lot of the everyday anxieties and self-doubt that life can push down on you. Of course, now we know from episode 1 that the whole thing was the midichlorians in my bloodstream. Talk about good microbiome. Anyway.
And my favorite supporting character is, without question, Porkins, the fat Star Wars character. Now, you got Jabba, and you got, you know, the weird troll-looking guards at Jabba's palace, but the only dude in these movies, or woman for that matter, that's a big old fat ass, is Porkins. And the fact that the fat guy's name is Porkins, comedy gold. Especially if it's unintentional.
The build-up to the final proton torpedo shot in the Death Star, it's perfect. You know, the pacing in A New Hope is so classically good that in game design books, they will often point to it as like an example of a perfect engagement curve. Meaning you have this strong attention-grabbing scene as Princess Leia's ship is getting chased by the Imperial Star Destroyer. There's these alternating scenes where the action rises and then calms down a little, but it gradually escalates and builds up to the Battle of Yavin, which is this awesome climax. And then everything just kind of winds down in the last couple minutes of the movie. That curve of engagement is like considered the kind of thing you should be aiming for as you're planning out the design and narrative arc of a game's story. And everything about that sequence, including the way the music builds up towards the end, reinforces that. I don't have words to say how good that is.
Before the Death Star gets blown up after the trench run, when it's like bow, 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 meow, 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 meow. I hope you guys like my musical talents, because I'm really cementing that I'm a talent to watch out for in that world. Oh, Jesus.
Here's another video game connection, is the attack on the Death Star. And I was watching this the other day, I could not help but think of all the times that I've done the run on the Death Star. Because in so many video games, we've all done this, right? Like, there's been so many times, whether it's in like a hyper-realistic version or a Lego version, we've all done the Death Star run, you know? We've all fought the TIE fighters in the air and then had to take out some of the towers on the way in, and then you go in through the trench and you hit that exhaust port at the end. And it's weird. It's a very cool scene, but it's a scene that I feel like a personal connection to, because like I feel like I've done it in a really strange way, and I love it for that. I feel a personal connection to this because I feel like I've been there too. And it's a thrilling scene. I mean, the dialogue's really good. I know a lot of this dialogue's actually lifted from like a World War II movie called The Dam Busters, I believe. You can go watch a comparison video on YouTube. It's really interesting to see how closely George Lucas borrowed, shall we say, the dialogue and pacing of the scene from that one. But it's still a really good scene, and it's a scene that having played it so many times in video games feels more real to me, I think, because of that. And then Luke blows up the Death Star. He uses the Force like Obi-Wan tells him to, turns off his guidance system, and he takes the shot, and it goes in, and the Death Star explodes. Now, Darth Vader, of course, is not defeated at this point. He was knocked out of course by the Millennium Falcon swooping in at the last second. And Darth Vader like goes spinning off into the blackness of space, which I always thought was a really like almost comedic, like not end point for the villain, because we know he comes back. But as far as this movie is concerned, that's the end of Darth Vader, and it's a really weirdly comedic moment of him like spinning off into space. And then our heroes return home, and we get the epic celebration scene that, again, it set kind of the standard for what should happen in a Star Wars movie. You've got to have a celebration scene in your Star Wars movie. Most of them. I know Empire doesn't have it, but that's because Empire is just Depression, the movie. But here we are. The troops are all lined up, and there's Han and Chewie and Luke walking down between them as that celebration music plays, walking up the aisle to Princess Leia, who puts a medal onto Han Solo, puts a medal onto Luke Skywalker, doesn't put anything on Chewbacca the Wookiee. Now, I've just recently, thanks to the fine dudes over at Star Wars Comics Daily, been reading the comic book version of this original movie from 1977, and in that there's a line where it says like, Chewbacca will get his own medal, but there's not a space princess around who's tall enough to put that on the Wookiee, so he'll have to do it himself. And I don't know if that was like something from the script of the movie, or if that was the comic book writer being like, hey, how come Chewbacca doesn't get a medal? That's not very cool. But there it is, man. It's Star Wars.
So, in the previous movies, I think I was, and plenty of people are pretty harsh on George Lucas there. But here, I think this is his best directed movie. And yeah, I think it's very famous and kind of common knowledge at this point to film nerds or Star Wars nerds in general, that the movie was heavily saved in the edit and what the maybe shaky first draft and all the process that he went through with that. But in the end, you got to really recognize here and give him a ton of credit for the direction that he was absolutely doing at the time. Think of all the iconic imagery in there and all the writing that went into it. But he did a good job here, and he needs to be recognized for that. It wasn't just in the edit. Yeah, the edit really took all the raw materials that he generated and polished it, but he still generated all those raw materials. And speaking of those raw materials, here's where I want it to be also a compliment in the end. I don't think George Lucas is necessarily all that original, really. He has a really good quality like Quentin Tarantino. Lucas and Tarantino both have their passions, and you can tell what they are because they are heavily influenced by a lot of things that, he loves. He takes them, smashes them all together into something new, something arguably better than what it originally was, and fashions it into Star Wars or Pulp Fiction or Kill Bill and makes it into something new that's more approachable, more consumable by so many other people. So they take what they love that might be kind of niche, and then they share it with so many other people by making it so much stronger. Again, I think it's probably greater than the sum of its parts. And again, here, a lot of this, I'm sure, is known by so many of the listeners here. But the whole format of the series is based on, it's a direct reference or an homage to old serialized science fiction movie serials like Buck Rogers or, The Phantom. And those in turn were influenced by old serial science fiction magazines like Galaxy Magazine. So you look at what Star Wars is, it's so much by the 70s. I don't know, definitely not the kids. They weren't being exposed to this science fiction of the early 1930s going through that into the 40s and 50s, and that's what he's directly referencing here, but he's giving it that modern polish that's bringing in, so you can see his love of that. He's sharing it, and he's putting it on the screen. I mean, the whole format is that, but it's down to those individual patented Star Wars wipes between scenes. That's right out of those Buck Rogers serials. The individual storyline here also is a direct lift from, you can clearly see it all the time, his influence from 1950s Japanese cinema. This storyline is the Hidden Fortress from 1958. The basic storyline is the princess with a young warrior saving her. It even had two dudes who were R2-D2 and C-3PO. Little shorter fat guy, taller skinny guy. They were the kind of bumbling, companions to the main heroes in the story. That's there. So again, he's taking these classic kind of samurai 50s movies and throwing that up on there, combined with this old 1930s science fiction. The space battles that you see are direct. Basically, you put a TIE fighter over a German fighter plane, and you have World War II bomber footage. And that's what that is. It's gun turrets, literal gun turrets from a B-17 bomber in the Millennium Falcon. And then you have your fantasy stuff. I don't need to really get into it here, but I have no doubt that Lord of the Rings, Sauron, was a heavy influence on Darth Vader and what he's there. The religion and the mythology around the Jedi, again, that's heavily influenced by the Japanese culture, even beyond just the samurai movies that we see there. The list here goes on and on and on. But like I said, you can see all these individual passions of his. While each individually might not be necessarily an original thing, he combines them in such unique and interesting ways, it becomes super entertaining and just wildly consumable.
Star Wars, this movie is one of the most, it's the most famous film ever made for a reason. It means so much to so many people, myself included. It's beautiful, it's brilliant. If you've never seen it, you're probably not listening to this podcast, but if you've never seen these movies, just watch them. Just hunt them down, hunker down, honestly. Get all, 11 now? 10 theatrically released Star Wars movies, and 11th this summer, or this winter, sorry. And then just find the Ewok movies in the holiday special and just watch them all, because it's so good. It's such an amazing universe to be a part of. And this movie's so hilarious too. These movies have such a great sense of humor that I feel like they're not credited for. If I had to pick, I would say that Empire is funnier than this one, but there's still so much comedy with Han Solo and Chewbacca and C-3PO and R2-D2, and I'm just getting jittery thinking about it. It's such a clear vision of this world.
I think this movie had just the right amount of depth to the details and design. The prequels would often throw so much up on the screen to spot tiny little spaceships in the background. Hey, did you see the Millennium Falcon there? The kitchen sink was literally thrown into one of the battles. In this, that core idea is there. You're seeing a lot on the screen, but I think it's just that appropriate amount for you to watch it and still get lost into that world and rewatch it a million times and focus on all these other little things. And this was all there before Lucas monkeyed with the special editions. But look at all those characters in the cantina. Look at all the different droids when Luke is trying to buy them. Look at the detail on the surface of the Death Star when they're going through it. I mean, it can be summed up in, there's blue freaking milk for you to look at and kind of get in there. All these things gave that movie just such character. It felt real. It felt more substantial than any of the CGI stuff, obviously. It doesn't feel like a sterile soundstage. It felt like a real world. But then when they wanted it to feel like a sterile soundstage, like on Imperial ships or the Death Star, or the Blockade Runner, because they have, money in that felt real and different too, and just that variety. Again, it gave it just such enduring depth. It gave this movie such sustained life. I love the passion and energy that clearly was put into the movie during the making it, because you absolutely see it in the end. Now that I mentioned it, there is one more thing I want to add. Hey, Disney, if you're listening, and I'm sure you are because you monitor everything, re-release the original unadulterated versions of this movie. There's room for this too, and I'm not going to rail on the special edition too much, but I'll guarantee I will buy these movies again for what, the 5th or 6th time or something if these come out. So do it. You like making money. I like giving you money. So just, do it.
The original Star Wars is phenomenal. It's full of a bunch of great moments. It's an iconic American film, and it's one of my all-time favorites.
Even though Episode 4 is one that I don't go back and watch that often, I don't see A New Hope nearly as often as I do some of the others, it's still always going to have that place in my heart as kind of the impetus, like everybody else, obviously it's the impetus of the entire series, that everyone started loving it, but it's the one that gave me the motivation to really dig in and see that there was more to Star Wars than just what is on the screen. So yeah, that's me in A New Hope. I'm always gonna love it. It may not be my absolute favorite one, but it has some of the most fond memories for me.
I mean, what is there to say? It's Star Wars. It's A New Hope. It's a great movie. I absolutely love it. It's one of my favorite movies ever made. It's something that I remember loving as a kid, and I can sit down and watch it now. I was watching this around my parents the other day. I was partway through watching it over at their house, and so I was like, hey, everybody's cooking dinner, everybody's chit-chat. Can I put on Star Wars? And they're like, yeah, okay. And I put on, and I ended up sitting around watching Star Wars with my dad. I love it, man. I love watching Star Wars. It's so good. Who doesn't want to watch Star Wars just at any time? I'll tell you, and the only time I don't want to watch Star Wars is immediately after I watch Star Wars. I remember in How I Met Your Mother, there's an episode where they're talking about how Star Wars is the greatest movie ever made, and I believe it's Ted and Marshall at the end of the movie, or at the end of the episode. The coda is they're sitting around watching Star Wars. It gets to the very end of it, and they're like, "Wow, that was the best 177 minutes ever committed to film," or something like that. And then he turns to him and goes, "Do you want to watch it again?" And they're like, "Yeah," and they put it on again. Bull. That's not what happens. What happens when you finish watching Star Wars is you absolutely don't want to watch Star Wars again because you want to watch Empire Strikes Back. I'm so upset by this. I was thinking about somebody somewhere I saw saying this is the Star Wars movie I've seen the most. And I could not tell you of the original trilogy which Star Wars movie is the Star Wars movie I've seen the most, because I've seen all three of them exactly the same number of times. Because every time I watch Star Wars, I then go and watch Empire Strikes Back. And then when I finish Empire Strikes Back, I immediately watch Return of the Jedi. Because it's Star Wars. They're all one movie as far as I'm concerned. And I'm really excited to come back and talk to you about Empire Strikes Back.
How did people manage 3 whole years waiting for Empire Strikes Back to come out? This movie is so good, it just naturally demands a sequel.
Podcasters Assemble, Probably, Season 2, The Rise of Podcast, is a production of the We Can Make This Work Probably Podcast Network. This episode edited and produced by Tyler. Find more of our shows at probablywork.com and learn how to contribute to future episodes of Podcasters Assemble Probably by looking us up on Twitter at Casters Assemble. Submissions are always open. Thank you to everyone who was able to contribute to this episode. Be sure to check the show notes for links to places where you can find them all online. Podcasters Assemble Probably will return in Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope.